This is your teacher, James Zucker, and I am going to talk right now about the new APUS history framework. New is a little bit relative here. It's been in play now for about 2 to 3 years. But I know for many of you, this may be new. You may have just started teaching APUS history and wondering what the big changes have been about. For those of you guys who are veterans to the class, who have seen these changes now for the last couple of years, you'll be very familiar with this. So I hope that this will just be a good overview to give to everybody, just as a way to review what changes have taken place and what you should be expecting out of this new framework. One of the big things I've been teaching about now for the last few years to incoming APUS history teachers and veteran teachers who have been concerned and worried about all the changes that are taking place is just to take note of the fact that really we've been doing all the stuff that the framework asks us to do. We just have to be a little bit more conscious of it now. And the good news is that in many ways the framework is meant to be a thematic framework. So that means that we don't have to go into a lot of the discrete facts we used to have to teach. Instead, and this is my big push that I want to make a big thing about in this video, the examples and the evidence that we use inside of class are really meant to be illustrative of the big themes that we teach. So I think this should remove some of the concern and anxiety that so many of us have had about the changes that are taking place. So the big first thing that I want to talk about is that historical thinking skills within this new framework are really prioritized over the content itself. So the change really is a focus from facts to what are called higher order thinking skills, or what are called HOTS, and what I'll be referring to from here on out as the HOTS. The facts are still important. And this is one of the things I think people get kind of mixed up on. Whenever I talk about this inside of a lot of training sessions, people always say, is the College Board really trying to say that we don't have to teach facts anymore? Not at all. The facts are still important, but they are meant to be used to illustrate those big thinking skills that we want the students to get across. Also, the curriculum has been broken up now into significant themes, which I'll go over in just a few minutes. The idea really here is to take the themes, take the thinking skills, use those key examples that we know from U.S. history in order to illustrate them, in order to get the students to do a lot of their own independent thinking. So the test then for the class has changed more to one about analysis and about writing. Even the multiple choice is now about analyzing readings, not about answering discrete questions about facts. And most of our tests now is broken up into writing sections. So we have the short answers, the document-based question, and what used to be called the free response question is now called the long essay. So the first thing to talk about are these time periods. And you'll notice here a few things. I don't want to go over every single detail on these time periods because I really don't want to bore you, but there are a few things I think are really important about these time periods. First of all, they've added on 2 time periods. They've added on period 1 and period 9. But notice that these are only 5% each on the test. The real bulk of the test still remains what we've taught about in the past. So that antebellum war period leading up till 1877 with the Civil War, and then the period right after that that leads us up into the 1970s with both of the world wars, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and some of the major changes that we saw happening during that time. So even though there's more that we're teaching, in some ways we're not teaching more. We're not teaching more because first of all, these time periods are not stressed, the 1st and the 9th, and secondly, all of these time periods are meant to be thematic, so we don't have to go into depth and detail by providing all of the major facts from each one of the time periods. The major themes that they're going to be suggesting that we teach. First of all, American and national identity. How has America throughout time been defining itself on a cultural level and ideological level as being uniquely American? Politics and power is another big one. And what you see a lot of times in the themes on this is a few different things. First of all, how has the federal government grown in power, and what is the relationship between the federal government and the states? Also, the constitutional power of the federal government is stressed under politics and power. Another big part of politics and power is cultural power, so it gets into reform movements and how those reform movements have influenced the United States. Big one is work, exchange, and technology. So this gets into everything from economic history to the relationship of labor to different groups. And of course, when it comes to technology, how new technologies have driven the American economy. Culture and society is especially important when we talk about issues of race and gender and class and how those have influenced American identity. Migration and settlement is incredibly important. We talk about the beginnings of American history with the migrations of Europeans over into the so-called New World and their contact then with Native American groups. But as we move away from that, we talk about the immigration pattern from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, eventually Africa and China. And when we talk about internal migration, such as the Great Migration that took place from 1920 up until 1970. Geography and environment plays a huge role in the question of how geography has influenced or even determined human action within the United States, especially plays a big role in the early part of the United States when we talk about the relationship of Native American tribal groups and kingdoms in relationship to European influences. And then last up, America in the world. What has our foreign policy been in the world and how we interacted? So a big part of this theme is that original neutrality proclamation of George Washington. Now, eventually we moved away from that with Manifest Destiny and then moving into the 20th century as we started to take on more of a leadership role throughout the world. So as far as the HOTS go, the higher order thinking skills that we want the kids to get across, there are several of them. There's comparison and contrast, cause and effect can then be broken down into change and continuity over time, cause and effect itself, and then periodization. And then for our document-based analysis, using things like contextualization, who the documents are being written for, the audience, the author or point of view of that author. And then last up, this new skill that's really being pushed a lot called synthesis, in which we make connections between time periods. Eventually, though, I'm going to make the argument that with all these thinking skills that you see up here, that there really only are about 2 thinking skills that are up here, and then the issue of contextualization. So the concept outline. The course description takes the time periods and connects them to themes and higher order thinking skills. Concept outline is going to provide you with a framework for the major ideas you have to teach in the class. And I want you to note that the examples that they use are meant to illustrate the issues in the class. Now here's where this is really important. Some of the concepts that you're given or some of the examples that you're given are required. Others are suggested. What's important is that you don't have to feel like you have to teach everything. What you're doing is you're using the required core material, and then you can teach around that required core material other examples that you think illustrate the major ideas and thinking skills of the outline. And this way you don't have to feel like you have to teach tons of discrete facts in the class. If you're wondering where you get some of this stuff from, in the first week I have posted a summary of all the major time periods and what I've found out of the concept outline that might be able to help you out a lot. I would suggest that you start with that as sort of like your core group and then move outside of that. Inside of your pacing, this is going to be rather difficult because you can't teach everything. But that's the point. You don't have to teach everything. Teach thematically, use the required concepts, and then build some suggested concepts around those in order to get through the class in a way that helps students to understand the time periods. The point that I'm making up here, don't get bogged down in the details. Think about the bigger themes and these bigger thinking skills. So some of the changes to the test itself. The old test, as you probably remember, was based upon an 80 multiple choice question test in 55 minutes. Document-based question was 60 minutes. And then you had a first free response question in 35 minutes and another one in the next 35 minutes. You'll notice that this has changed now with the new test to focus much more on the writing section. So now there are 55 multiple choice questions in 55 minutes for 40% of the test. There are 4 short answers in 50 minutes for 20% of the test. There is a document-based question in 55 minutes. That's 25% of the test. And then there is 1 long essay. Now, students are going to get 2 choices. They get to choose one of those essays. They write it in 35 minutes, and that is 15% of the test. So a few things about the multiple choice that are really important. The old multiple choice was a critical thinking question with 5 possible answers. The new multiple choice is a primary or secondary source reading with 4 possible answers that come after that. Questions are not about comprehension of the passage. Rather, they're using the higher order thinking skills to analyze the reading. After this, they have short answers. They're very similar to the multiple choice, and the students are going to get a primary source, secondary source, or graphic image. They will then get a question that's broken up into 3 sections. The students will have to address each one of these questions separately. Now here's the good news. The students do not have to provide an in-depth answer to every single section. Rather, they're going to answer using the themes that you've taught in class and the higher order thinking skill or the HOT that is directly asked for within that question. And I would expect the following pattern. This is what I've seen in most of these short answer questions. You can prime your students to do this. You don't want to have your students always assume it's going to be this way, but this is a good way for them to kind of predict where things are going to go. They have to summarize the overall passage, then provide 1 brief example that provides support, 1 brief example that provides for dissent. So here's an example. When we take a look at this, and this was an actual question provided on one of the tests, we have a political cartoon from the late 1880s. And if you take a look at what is expressed in each one of the A, B, and C, the first one asks for a brief explanation of what the artist is trying to explain here, then some kind of development during this time period that supports the argument inside of the political cartoon, and then one that dissents against it. the document-based questions. So the DBQ now, we know in the past it used to be about 8 to 12 documents each year. Now we know it's a 7-document maximum. That's as many as they're going to ask. The reason why is because the students are going to do more with this DBQ. First, they have to provide a thesis that answers the prompt. Then they're going to analyze the documents, not paraphrase. And they can do this by using one of the following: audience, point of view, or purpose. The students are also going to need to provide contextualization and historical context. Now, these two items often get teachers really mixed up. What's the difference between contextualization and historical context? I'll explain that in a little bit and demonstrate to you. It's not that difficult to understand the two things, but we do have to have some way to explain it to the kids. And then they finish up by providing what's called a synthesis. So here are some of the tough ones, I think, that teachers feel like they face with the new DBQ. First off, there's a second point for corroborating or dissenting views. It's under the thesis point. What does this mean? Well, when they redid the DBQ, they were trying to mesh together AP World History with AP US History. AP World History does something called dimensional scoring on their grading, which means there are singular points, either 1 or 2 points for particular skills, whereas AP US History used to do holistic grading, took a look at the overall essay and asked what point score the essay should get. Well, this was sort of a give-me to the AP US History graders, and this particular point then is graded off of the overall coherency or strong organization. So I would suggest when you look at this, don't look at it so much as a thesis point, but this second point in the rubric under the thesis is much more about the whole essay. Do you feel that the essay provides an overall coherency? Do you think it provides corroborating and supporting evidence? Do you think that it gives a dissenting view and then shows how that dissenting view is overall not correct? Another tough one is the difference between contextualization versus historical context. A lot of teachers are really confused on how to explain this to the students. So here's the analogy I like to use. Imagine that you are on an airplane and that you look out in this airplane, and when you're up in the air, you see the big picture, you see the horizon. That's contextualization. Contextualization is the big picture issues and trends. But now you land the airplane, you're on the tarmac, and you're looking at the runway, you're looking at the trees, and you're looking at the specific people running around the airplane. That's the historical context, the specific events that influence the document. Then the last one is this issue of synthesis. Synthesis, there are actually a couple different ways we can approach this. One way that I like best is a parallel with another time period. I think students tend to understand this best because this is why most students think we do history, is that you're trying to make comparisons between time periods. Another way you can do it, though, is to discuss an issue that's not talked about in the question. So let's say the question is about politics. You could talk about economics. Questions about economics, you could talk about ideology. Basically what a student is doing is they're giving added value to whatever that particular question is asking about. And finally, we hit the long essay. So in the case of the long essay, the students are going to get two choices now for the long essay. They have to choose one out of these, and they can be all the major skills that we talked about for the HOT. So they can be comparison contrast, cause and effect, change and continuity, or periodization. In the end, though, here's what's kind of interesting about this. Really, all of these skills narrow down to two skills. The two skills are comparison, contrast, or change over time. So this is the way I like to explain it to my students. When you really think about it, what do we do in history? Well, we either compare and contrast time periods, compare and contrast groups of people, we compare and contrast ideas, or you do change over time. How does one time period lead into the next time period? What's the continuity between these time periods? And if you think about that, even that eventually becomes a comparison contrast question. How does one time period, is it similar or does it differ from another time period? So, the scoring for the long essay. Students must have a thesis that addresses the question and the thinking skill. They also have to use the HOTS, whatever the higher order thinking skill is being asked for, they have to do that within their paragraphs. And they can't double dip. They can't expect the point for the thesis as well as using the HOTS in the paragraphs. Students then have to provide historical support or evidence for their argument, and then they have to end up with a synthesis very similar to the DBQ. A synthesis, so again, we're doing parallel between time periods or adding on to the question. So what are the takeaways? Remember that this new test is really not that different from what you have been doing in the past. The focus now is on higher order thinking skills and themes instead of focusing on discrete facts. The examples are important, but they are illustrative of the big ideas, the big themes, the big historical thinking skills. And you really need to teach the students to use context in order to decode questions. So we want to move away from summarization, paraphrasing arguments, or just providing basic facts. What we're really looking to is the overall context.